In the summer of 1968, a small party of cavers climbed the Limestone Canyon above the West Fork of Brush Creek, in the White River National Forest west of Gypsum, Colorado. They were looking for what cavers in that decade were always looking for, an opening in rock that nobody else had bothered to follow to its end. They found one, a low crack at the base of a cliff face, cold air moving steadily out of it even in July, the kind of draft that tells an experienced caver there is more mountain behind the wall than in front of it. When they climbed in with carbide lamps, the passage did not stop. It dropped, turned, opened into rooms wide enough to lose a flashlight beam in, and kept going. Somewhere in those first hours underground, more than one of them heard something they could not place. A low sound, rising and falling, drifting up from somewhere back in the dark. They gave the cave a name that day, and the name stuck. They called it Groaning Cave. 57 years later, it is still the longest known cave in Colorado, nearly 15 miles of surveyed passage inside a mountain that most drivers on the road below will never know is hollow. It sits right now behind a locked steel gate whose combination changes twice a week, reachable only by a short list of names held by a handful of volunteers, closed by federal order for 8 months of the year. What is inside that mountain is documented in more detail than almost any cave in the state. What keeps people out of it is not hidden, it is written down, in plain language, by the people who wrote the order. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The sound took years to run down. Early visitors assumed something alive was moving in the lower passages, and for a while the cave's name carried that weight, a groan with no confirmed source. A 1973 survey of Colorado caves finally traced it to wind, funneled through a narrow throat of passage under specific pressure conditions, resonating the way a bottle resonates when you blow across the top of it. The explanation is unglamorous and it is correct. It is also, in its own way, the first lesson the cave teaches about itself. What sounds unexplained from the entrance usually has an explanation waiting somewhere down the passage, if someone is willing to go find it. Groaning Cave has needed people willing to go find things ever since. The boundaries of the system were roughly established within the first few years after 1968, but the interior has kept giving up new passage every decade since, through crawls, fissures, and vertical domes cut into a limestone canyon more than 9,000 feet above sea level. The rock itself is old sedimentary limestone, laid down under an ancient sea and later folded upward with the rest of the Rockies, riddled over millions of years by water finding the softest seams and dissolving them into passage. Cavers who have worked the survey for decades still describe hundreds of leads that have never been pushed to their ends, side passages noted in a logbook and never returned to, drafts felt at the edge of a headlamp beam and never chased. It is not a small dark room with an oral history attached to it. It is close to 15 miles of mapped rock, in a state where the next longest system does not come close, and the map is still not finished. In places, the walls carry delicate mineral growths that took thousands of years to reach the length of a finger, formations that a single dragged rope or a careless boot can undo in an instant, and that no amount of institutional will can regrow on any human timescale. That unfinished quality is the reason for almost everything that has happened to Groaning Cave since. Because of its fragility, and because the cave has long served as a hibernation and swarming site for several bat species, the United States Forest Service and a volunteer group called the Colorado Cave Survey have managed Groaning jointly since the 1980s under a signed Memorandum of Understanding, the Eagle Ranger District of the White River National Forest Sharing Authority with cavers who do the actual gatekeeping. The road to the trailhead is not maintained by the county and is often impassable until after Memorial Day, which by itself limits the season further than the paperwork does. Once a caver reaches the gate, the rules waiting there are specific rather than vague. The system works like this. A caver who wants to visit must first submit a hazard disclosure form. They must be equipped with a helmet and 3 independent sources of light. Their group must run no smaller than 2 people and no larger than 6. Their trip leader must have already been inside the cave at least twice, under someone else who already knew the way. Only after all of that is satisfied does a volunteer coordinator release the current combination to the gate, a combination that is changed roughly every 3 or 4 days, specifically so that it cannot spread beyond the people who were actually cleared to have it. A logbook sits just inside that gate. Every trip leader is required to write down who entered, when, where in the cave they intended to go, and to write again when they came back out. Management plans exist from 1985 and from 2024, each one revised because the cave and the pressure on it had changed enough to require a new set of rules. None of this is theoretical caution. Larry Fish, a Colorado caver, compiled a detailed study of who visited Groaning Cave between 1980 and 2000, tracking traffic patterns year over year, well before anyone was talking about pandemics or fungal disease. Paul Fowler did the same for 2017 and 2018, and again for 2019. Mary Klaus, who still coordinates access today, published a visitation summary for 2021, the first-year trips resumed after the cave sat completely unvisited in 2020. Access to Groaning Cave, in other words, has been tracked on paper for more than 4 decades, not by a government office with a budget line, but by cavers keeping their own records because they understood, earlier than most agencies did, that an unmonitored cave gets damaged and a monitored one survives. In recent years, the volunteers who hold the combination have had to tighten their own screening further, after a rise in vandalism and graffiti inside the system prompted the Forest Service to direct more detailed questioning of anyone requesting access, how much caving experience they have, what they intend to see, who can vouch for them. A cave that 2 men and a dog could once have stumbled into now requires a phone call, a reference check, and a form on file before anyone gets near the gate. The bat closure sits on top of all of that, and it is newer, and it is not specific to Groaning Cave at all. Groaning is closed to visitors every year from the 15th of August through the 15th of April, the window during which its resident bats are either hibernating or gathering to swarm before winter. That closure is not a local decision. It comes from a region-wide order issued by the Forest Service's Rocky Mountain region, which covers 17 national forests and 7 national grasslands across Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, and most of South Dakota and Wyoming. In the spring of 2023, a Yuma bat found on the ground at Bent's Old Fort National Historic Site in Otero County near La Junta tested positive for white nose syndrome, the first confirmed case of the disease in Colorado. The fungus behind it, Pseudogymnoascus destructans, had already killed more than 1 million bats since it first turned up in a New York cave in 2006, spreading west across the country one hibernation season at a time, appearing eventually in bats across 40 states and 9 Canadian provinces. It works by growing on the skin of hibernating bats, on the muzzle and the wings, irritating them awake during the coldest months of the year when there is nothing left to eat and no insects flying to replace the fat they burn getting up. A bat can survive 1 interruption. Repeated interruptions, through a winter it is supposed to sleep through undisturbed, are usually fatal. A year after the Otero County case, biologists testing bats along the Front Range, between Fort Collins and Colorado Springs, found 32 more positive cases, the disease's furthest confirmed reach into the state to date, most of them in little brown bats. The Forest Service responded that same year with a 3-year region-wide order covering 88 caves across 4 states, 46 more than its previous order in 2021, 16 of them inside the White River National Forest alone. A wildlife biologist with the agency, Melissa Dressen, explained the logic plainly to a reporter that fall. Waking a hibernating bat costs it fat reserves it cannot replace until spring, and a bat already fighting a fungal infection cannot afford that cost twice. Tina Jackson, a species conservation coordinator with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, said the closures had been issued ahead of the disease rather than behind it, an attempt to protect roosts before the fungus arrived rather than after. Unlike the East Coast, where the same disease forced most cave systems into year-round closure because mortality there ran close to total, if you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Colorado's land managers are still trying seasonal closures instead, betting that the state's drier climate, more fragmented bat populations, and more varied microclimates might slow what has proven close to unstoppable everywhere else it has gone. Cavers themselves have become part of the monitoring effort, helping biologists establish that most Colorado bat species, aside from the Townsend's big-eared bat, do not actually rely on caves and old mines as heavily as their eastern relatives do, a finding that has let land managers target specific roosts instead of closing every opening in the state. It is a strange kind of partnership, biologists and recreational cavers working from the same data, but it exists because the recreational cavers were the ones already going underground and taking notes long before white nose syndrome gave the Forest Service a reason to ask them for help. Groaning Cave is not the only place in that forest carrying this exact weight. 15 miles southeast of Eagle, inside the same White River National Forest, sits Fulford Cave, a smaller system with its own layered and half-recorded history. An 1874 survey expedition led by the geologist Ferdinand Hayden is generally credited with the first documented discovery, though a man named Captain Nolan Smith separately claimed to have found it in 1890, and the small mining settlement that grew up nearby was known first as Nolan's Camp before it took the Fulford name. The cave itself was not formally mapped until 1952, when members of the Colorado Grotto, the state's oldest chapter of the National Speleological Society, chartered the year before in Golden, finally surveyed its roughly 1 mile of passage and 7 named rooms, 78 years after Hayden's party first walked past it. One rock formation deep inside is still known locally for its resemblance to the hindquarters of an elephant, the kind of detail that survives in a place mostly because generations of visitors kept repeating it to each other underground. Fulford carries the same seasonal closure Groaning does, shut to the public from the 15th of October through the 15th of April, again for bat hibernation, again requiring a Forest Service permit before anyone can enter, even during the open months. A short drive from both of them, Premonition Cave, also inside White River National Forest, has been closed to entry year-round, not seasonally, because the combination of multiple resident bat species and confirmed white nose exposure made partial access too risky to manage. 3 caves, 1 national forest, 3 separate closure schedules, each one calibrated to what biologists have actually found living inside that particular mountain. The pattern is not confined to caves that already required a locked gate. Near Manitou Springs, more than 100 miles to the southeast, Cave of the Winds has run public tours since 1881, one of the oldest continuously operating tourist attractions in the state. Its main chambers first documented the year before by 2 boys named John and George Pickett, who followed flickering candlelight and a draft of moving air into a crevice while out hiking with their pastor, Reverend Roselle T. Cross. Local tradition already held that the cave was tied to Apache stories of a great spirit of the wind living inside the mountain, which is likely where its name came from even before the Pickett boys crawled in. Cross wrote up the discovery for his church newsletter, and the Colorado Springs Gazette reprinted it within days, on the 2nd of July, 1880. More than a century later, in 1984, cavers working past the mapped tourist route broke into a room nobody had recorded before, its walls lined with rare, slow-growing crystal formations called helictites, delicate enough that a change in humidity or temperature can stop their growth permanently. The room was named Silent Splendor. It was never opened to the public. Instead, the cave's owners sealed it behind what they call an environmental gate, a barrier fitted with a tube designed specifically to hold moisture inside the chamber and keep the atmosphere stable enough for the crystals to keep forming. It is a strange thing to stand in that cave today. Visitors ride a free-fall attraction called the Pterodactyl bolted to the cliff face outside and walk lit, paved tunnels past a century of tourist graffiti, while a few 100 feet away, behind a door most of them never notice, sits a room that has been growing in total silence and total darkness since before most of them were born. A cave open to paying visitors since the Victorian era still has a room inside it that almost no one alive has ever seen, closed not because anyone is hiding what it contains, but because opening it would kill the very thing that makes it worth protecting. Put those pieces on the same table, and a shape appears, though it is a different shape than most hidden history channels usually promise. Every closure order named here is a public document. Every biologist quoted is on the record, under their own name, explaining a decision that any caver can read in full before ever picking up the phone to request a combination. What the pattern actually shows is something quieter and in its way stranger, an entire category of American landscape that we have mapped in exhaustive administrative detail and barely mapped in physical fact. The Forest Service can tell you to the day when Groaning Cave closes and when Fulford closes and why Premonition never reopens. Volunteer coordinators can tell you exactly who has walked into Groaning Cave in any given year since 1980, cross-referenced against a logbook inside a locked gate. And after all of that record keeping, after 57 years of trips logged in careful handwriting, nobody, not the Forest Service, not the Colorado Cave Survey, not the cavers who have devoted decades to the project, can tell you where all 15 miles of passage actually go. Hundreds of leads sit unpushed in the survey notes right now, corridors that someone has stood at the mouth of, lamp raised, and then turned back from for lack of time, or rope, or daylight left in the trip. That is the real condition of the cave today, and it has nothing to do with secrecy. Nothing about Groaning Cave is sealed by excuse. It is sealed by a combination lock changed twice a week for reasons published in a management plan anyone can request, and by a federal order that names the fungus, the bat species, and the biologist who signed off on the closure. Compare that to how these things used to be handled. A century ago, a discovery like this one would likely have ended up owned outright by whoever found it first, fenced, ticketed, and lit for tourists within a decade, its wild passages blasted wider to fit a walking tour, the way Cave of the Winds itself was reshaped for paying visitors starting in the 1880s. Groaning Cave never went that direction. No one built a parking lot at the trailhead, no one strung electric lights past the entrance room. The cave stayed exactly as difficult to reach as it was in 1968, on purpose, because the same people who explored it were the ones who decided, one management plan at a time, that difficulty was the best protection they could offer it. The only thing standing between a curious person and the far end of Groaning Cave's longest unexplored lead is not an institution protecting a secret. It is a short list of qualified trip leaders, a finite caving season running from roughly Memorial Day to mid-August, and the physical difficulty of pushing new passage at 9,000 feet in cold, wet limestone one crawl at a time. The mountain has not been hiding anything from anyone. It has simply been larger than the number of hours anyone has ever had available to look at it. Somewhere above Brush Creek right now, the gate is locked, the combination is whatever it was changed to a few days ago, and the logbook just inside it holds the most recent names of people who went in and the times they came back out. Bats that biologists have been testing since 2023 are sleeping in chambers those cavers were careful not to disturb. The wind that gave the cave its name is still moving through the same narrow throat of rock it has moved through for as long as anyone has been listening, no longer mysterious, still audible if the pressure is right. And somewhere past the point where the last survey team turned around, in the dark, under a mountain that has been open to careful visitors for 57 years and fully explored by no one, the passage that started with a low crack and a draft of cold July air is still going. What it means, if you take the record at its word, is not that something is being kept from you. It is that some places are simply bigger than the century we have had to look at them, and that the honest ending to this particular story is not a revelation. It is an open ledger, a locked gate, and a map with hundreds of blank lines still waiting to be walked. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.